In 2006, I discovered a psychedelic mushroom in Roslin Chapel, a Catholic church in Scotland, that was the catalyst for this entire research. Today, I'd like to share some of the findings of the Psychedelic Gospels. Albert Hofmann, who first experienced LSD in 1943, had a very challenging first experience. As he said, I was seized by the dreadful fear of going insane. I was taken to another time, another place, another world. Was I dying? For me, my first experience with orange sunshine at a rainbow family gathering high in the Rockies in Colorado was also a very challenging experience. I was in a very tumultuous time in my life. That was my set. And that little tab of acid spun me into a Carlos Castaneda-like world of malevolent spirit. And it was a real learning experience. I felt challenged by it. Where was my instant nirvana? Where was my numinous nirvana? Where was my instant enlightenment that Timothy Leary was promising? Nowhere to be found. But undaunted, I decided, I want to learn a lot more about psychedelics. I want to learn a lot more. And as a professor, as an anthropologist, I decided to design a course then titled Hallucinogens and Culture, which I taught at Florida International University from 1975 to 2014 when I retired there. It's still in the catalog. It may be the first 4-credit course on psychedelics in the country. This course starts off with a discussion of what are the major landmarks in the study of hallucinogens and culture. My favorite is the miracle at Marsh Chapel, the Good Friday experiment conducted in 1962 by Walter Pahnke at Marsh Chapel at Boston University. This study created an illuminated synthesis between religion and science, and it definitively proved that synthetic psilocybin could create and generate an authentic mystical experience. What happened? It was a double-blind experiment. They gave to 10 divinity students psilocybin. They gave to the other 10 divinity students niacin as a placebo. 9 out of the 10 students who received the psilocybin had a full-blown mystical experience. And one of them, Houston Smith, the eminent scholar of religion who died recently, said, "This was the most powerful cosmic homecoming I have ever experienced." Walter H. Clark, a distinguished psychologist, said, "There are no other experiments known to me in the history of the scientific study of religion better designed or clearer in their conclusions than this one." 25 years later, Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, did a follow-up study. 25 years later, he found 7 out of the 9 divinity students who experienced the psilocybin. And he found that for all of them, they considered this to be one of the most important and enduring experiences in their life. We believe my sense is that this is my favorite landmark study because it creates an important, significant thread in the tapestry of the history of psychedelics, uniting the ancient past with the present psychedelic renaissance. In writing about the Johns Hopkins and the NYU studies with cancer patients, the article goes on, in both trials, the intensity of the mystical experience described by patients correlated with the degree to which their depression decreased. In our book, we propose that it was this access to divinity, this portal to the divine that the mushroom images in Christian art represent, is the reason why these were enshrined in early and medieval Catholic churches. Next slide, please. Our anthropological journey of discovery begins at Roslin Chapel in Scotland, where we were drawn by the Da Vinci Code. And in Roslyn, which is a synthesis of pagan and Catholic imagery, I discovered a psychoactive Amanita mushroom sculpted into the forehead of Roslyn's most prominent green man, hanging down from the ceiling in the very front of the chapel. I showed this, Julie and I showed this to Paul Stamets, the eminent mycologist, and he said, this is a taxonomically correct Amanita muscaria. And then he laughed and he said, let me get my computer. And he pulled it out and he had photographs of this and of other mushrooms enshrined in Roslyn. In addition, this started us thinking, well, what about other Catholic churches? What's going on in Catholicism? What about the life of Jesus? What about the disciples? And now, while our minds were on the verge of a rambunctious overthrow of reason, the words of Carl Sagan kicked in. What did he say? He said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if you are going to present such controversial theories about psychedelics in Christianity, you better go out and gather some extraordinary evidence. And this is what we did, next slide, traveling through chapels and cathedrals and abbeys in France and Germany and all of the places you see on the map, and looking and finding psychedelic mushrooms in stained glass windows, mosaics, illuminated Bibles, sculpture, fresco. These are the places we visited. We also went to Israel, and we couldn't get to Egypt because of the Arab Spring and the uprisings, but we saw many entheogens in the Egyptian artifacts in the museums of Paris and England. Let's go on to the next slide. This is a small church, the Church of St. Martin de Vic, in the center of France. The outside is drab. It has a plain brown door. And when you walk inside, it's the colors, even restored from 1,000 years ago, are amazing. This is a work of genius. Walking in there was like having cataracts lifted from your eyes, which I have done, and all of a sudden seeing clearly again. And when we walked into the choir and we looked at this fresco of Jesus entering Jerusalem, riding on the ass, followed by his disciples, Julie grabbed my arm and she said, Jerry, do you see what I see? And I looked in the upper corner there and I said, oh yes, I see what you see. One of the joyful youth welcoming Jesus to Jerusalem is holding the stem of one of 5 tan, smooth, large psilocybin mushroom caps. Now, we've heard that size matters, and it certainly matters in Romanesque art. Size did matter, and the fact that these caps are so large. When we follow this painting to the next wall, it takes you to the towers of Jerusalem. And there, what is growing out of the towers of Jerusalem? Large psilocybin mushroom caps being cut down with long knives. And then we could barely believe our eyes, because this tower overlooked a painting, a fresco of the Last Supper, which is in our book, with Jesus and the disciples, with mushroom caps on the table, the long knives, and when you look very closely at the photographs in our book, mushrooms drawn very distinctively into the hem of the disciples. It was at this point that we had our aha moment, and we said, this is an alternative history of Christianity. This is different from the master story. And this started to make sense because Pope Gregory in the 6th century said, people are illiterate. Let art be the Bible. Let art be the religious instruction of the illiterate. Now we had to ask ourselves and check ourselves again. We said, well, is this a marginal Catholic cult? Is this a renegade bunch of hippie priests operating far from the crown and the church out here in the center of France? We need to go to the high holy places of Christendom. We need to go to Chartres Cathedral. We need to go to Canterbury Cathedral. We need to go to St. Michael's Church in Germany. And here's what we found. Next slide, please. This is on the cover of our book. This comes from an illuminated Bible, which is richly illustrated and decorated with gold inlaid on it. And this is from the first folio, which has 12 drawings, including from Genesis. And this is God creates plants. But as you can see here, God is actually creating psychoactive mushrooms. The Amanita Mushroom mushroom, the blue psilocybin, because as we know, psilocybin turns bluish when oxidizes, and other psilocybin mushrooms that are kind of decorative, almost like holographic implants there. These have remained there, hidden in plain sight. Why hidden? Because the theologian, the art historian, the church historians don't have the background in ethnobotany or mycology to know what they're even looking at. In fact, I had one prominent art historian who wrote the commentary on the Canterbury Psalter say to me, Jerry, I wouldn't know a mushroom if I saw one. So we need a lot of education and interdisciplinary study. We went to Chartres Cathedral, which has 2 tiers of magnificent stained glass windows, 176 of them. We found distinct mushroom images in nearly 10% of the stained glass windows in Chartres Cathedral. And each one of them tells a different Bible story. This is the story of Placidus the Hunter in his conversion to St. Eustace. And you see he's surrounded by mushrooms, and you can see that this illumination is coming down through the concentric circles of light from heaven into his head and into his conversion. Let's go to St. Michael's Church in Hildesheim, Germany. This is one of the few places where we actually know who made the artwork. It is Bishop Bernward, who was the tutor of Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, and this Bishop Bernward was sainted by the Catholic Church. He was brilliant. He was a mathematician, a church builder, and a metallurgist, and he cast big bronze doors with mushrooms in the Garden of Eden. And this is a Christ column that he cast out of bronze. It is 13 feet high. It is almost 3 feet in diameter, and it tells the story of Jesus from his baptism by John until the entry into Jerusalem. And there are multiple scenes of psilocybin mushroom images. This is the Transfiguration, a turning point because it is one of the 2 places in the New Testament where a miracle happens to Jesus rather than him doing the miracle. And it is the first time where God intersects with humanity through Jesus, saying to the disciples who are standing there under the mushrooms, listen, this is my son, hear him well. 200 years later, the priestly descendants of Bishop Bernward created a ceiling painting 90 feet long on the whole nave of St. Michael's Church of the Jesse tree, telling the story of the lineage of Jesus all the way back through the Hebrew kings to the house of David. And at the very base of the Jesse tree are Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, bordered by a very large red and gold Amanita cap. This is an Amanita Muscaria. So we see these wherever we've gone. Can you go to the next slide? This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens of color photos and black and white photos which are analyzed and explained in depth throughout our book. And I want to make it very clear at this point that we are not here to challenge anyone's belief in Christianity, but rather to reveal a secret that many of you know and that I've learned in the long study of psychedelics is integral to many of the world's religions. We believe that in religious sacraments, and we believe they should encompass all sacraments, including psychoactive plants. And we quote in our book Brother David Stendhal Rost of the Order of St. Benedict, who said, if I can experience God through a sunset on a mountaintop, why not through a mushroom prayerfully ingested? This work, this research, has given us a threefold mission. One is continued research on the Psychedelic Gospels. We know our findings are controversial. In the end of our book, we call for the creation of an interdisciplinary committee on the Psychedelic Gospels to not only evaluate the analysis that we present, but all of the other many mushroom images that are turning up in churches and cathedrals from Europe to the Middle East and into Russia. We also call for more education, and we call for legalization. I want to talk about education for a minute. Why is education so important? because I went through a whole graduate program in anthropology at Cornell University with a minor in Latin American studies, one of the areas of the world where you find prolific use of psychedelics. And I'm not going to go through naming the different tribes, and you know, ayahuasca and peyote and San Pedro and others. But I'd never heard one word about psychedelics. The students who've come to my class for 4 decades, they tell me, Dr. Brown, I've never heard 95% of what you're talking about. So there is a big stigma, there is a big taboo, there is a big loss. And I applaud the call for bringing this into academia, but it's going to be a rough road and a long haul to get courses accredited into the program. I also want to applaud Thomas Roberts, who in his book, The Psychedelic Future of the Mind, raises this issue. And he says, to be an educated person in the 21st century, we ought to have the option to explore psychedelics at some point in our life. And we have called, Julie and I, for the creation of sacred centers, religious centers, sort of what existed in Eleusis, where people could go and responsibly explore psychedelics. I also want to talk, in order for that to happen, there's going to have to be legalization. And I applaud everything that MAPS is doing wholeheartedly. But what about the rest of us who don't need PTSD, trauma, psychedelic treatment, or cancer? What about the 26 million Americans who have explored LSD and other psychedelics and found they are very useful for personal growth, for creativity? Steve Jobs said, I love LSD. It was one of the most significant things in my life, and helped me create Apple and helped me think differently for creativity and innovation. We believe that, and we have found in the case of the Native American Church, in the case of Santo Dime, that in the case of Santeria, that the Supreme Court has been very rigorous and very generous in its interpretation of the First Amendment, that there will be no, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So we believe that legalization will be, through religious use, will be an avenue that will get us there faster and will cover many, many more people. And we think that the legal wheels and the institutional syncretism between Catholicism and other religions and psychedelics, such as has happened with the church in Brazil, is an important avenue to explore. I want to conclude. I would like to conclude by paraphrasing the final words of our book. Certainly, psychedelics have posed tremendous challenges throughout history to political and religious communities alike. With the coming of monotheism, psychedelics were suppressed as the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. And that's our conclusion. During the Inquisition, psychedelics were demonized as the tools of Satan by the inquisitors. And during the 1960s, psychedelics were banned as dangerous drugs. Now look, it took 300 years for the Catholic Church to apologize to Galileo. We hope it won't take that long for an apology to the wise women who were burned at the stake of the Inquisition for their knowledge of medicine and herbs. It's very rare in American life that you get a second chance, and psychedelics now have a second chance to do it right and come into the mainstream. This time around, let's explore them with an open heart and an open mind.